I used to believe that love, when poured unconditionally into a child, would always return in some form. Maybe not immediately, maybe not perfectly, but eventually. I thought that if I gave everything, my time, my energy, my compassion, my child would grow up to be kind, grateful, and loving. What no one prepared me for was the day I would look into my grown child's eyes and feel fear. Not fear of physical harm, but fear of being invisible, erased, reduced to a tool in someone else's emotional war. It didn't happen overnight. It rarely does. My son Ethan was always intense. Even as a little boy, he needed things to be his way. If I gave him the red cup instead of the blue, there were tears. If I praised his sister for something small, he withdrew. But I read every parenting book, listened to every podcast, attended every school meeting. I told myself, sensitive kids just need more understanding, more patience, more love, so I gave it. The real turning point came after his 20s. Ethan had always struggled with finding his place in the world, bounced from job to job, lived with friends, then came back home when things fell apart. I opened the door every time. My friends called it enabling. I called it parenting. But slowly, the tone of our home changed. My boundaries were no longer suggestions to him. They were insults. If I asked him to clean up after himself, I was being controlling. If I expressed frustration, he accused me of emotional manipulation. The words he used stung because they were so clinical, so rehearsed. It was like he had memorized a textbook on abuse and decided to flip the roles. He began twisting conversations. If I forgot something, he said I was losing my mind. If I defended myself, he claimed I was gaslighting him. Once, when I gently told him that the way he spoke to me felt cruel, he laughed and said, "You just can't handle the truth." I started questioning everything. Was I too harsh when he was a child? Did I miss the signs of trauma? Was I, in some way, responsible for the resentment he carried like armor? The guilt was suffocating. And yet, no matter how many late-night apologies I whispered into the dark, the cruelty didn't ease. He started ignoring me for days at a time, then exploding with demands: money, rides, help with paperwork. If I hesitated, I was met with silence or worse, shaming monologues about how I had failed him. He told relatives that I was unstable, that I played the victim. I watched as my own family began to doubt my version of events. He was charismatic, articulate, and, on the surface, reasonable. I felt like a ghost, screaming in a language no one else could hear. One evening, I found myself crying in the laundry room, clutching a shirt he'd thrown on the floor. It wasn't about the shirt. It was about the years I spent folding clothes, cooking meals, offering comfort, and realizing none of it had been enough to prevent this unraveling. That night, I called a therapist. I didn't say, "My son is abusive." I said, "I think something is wrong with me." Therapy gave me a mirror I didn't want to look into. It showed me that love alone isn't a shield, that sometimes we love people who harm us, that being a parent doesn't mean you have to accept pain indefinitely. I began setting boundaries, small at first, no yelling in the house, no name-calling. He called it censorship. I called it survival. When I refused to fund his latest business idea, he accused me of abandonment. But this time, I didn't back down. I cried in private, but I didn't back down. There were days he disappeared for weeks, and I felt both relief and grief in equal measure. I missed the version of him I thought I had raised. I mourned the relationship we never really had. And yet, I also began to rediscover myself, the woman who used to laugh easily, the woman who wrote poetry, the woman who could go an entire day without feeling like a failure. Eventually, he moved out. It wasn't dramatic, just a text. "I'm gone, don't contact me." The silence that followed felt like standing in a burned-out house, ashes still warm. But over time, the silence became space to breathe, to heal. I still love my son. That hasn't changed. But I no longer equate love with submission. I no longer confuse empathy with self-erasure. I don't expect closure. I don't demand understanding. I simply protect my peace. To anyone listening who feels the sting of being blamed for pain you didn't cause, know this: you are not alone. Emotional abuse doesn't always come from strangers or partners. Sometimes it grows in the very soil where we planted the deepest love. And sometimes the most radical act of love is letting go of someone who won't stop hurting you. Of course, here is the next portion of the story, continuing from the tone and pacing established in part 1. I didn't want to believe it at first. You raise a child with the hope that they will love you back. Not because you expect repayment, but because you pour your soul into them. You feed them, clothe them, guide them, give up sleep and dreams and years of your life, believing it builds something unshakable. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you wake up and realize the love you thought was growing never actually took root in them. As Daniel grew older, the tenderness from childhood vanished. At first, I chalked it up to the storm of adolescence. Everyone has their moods at 16, right? But even after high school, after college, when he became a man in the eyes of the world, the coldness only deepened. And I made excuses. That was my mistake. I protected him from judgment, even from my own. He's stressed, I'd say. He just needs space, but space turned into distance. Distance turned into silence. And silence eventually turned into something louder than screaming. It became resentment. I invited him for dinner every Sunday. I made his favorite meals: lasagna, meatloaf, even that dreadful kale and quinoa salad he used to love in college. He'd come late, if he came at all. And when he sat across from me, there was no warmth in his eyes, only impatience. He barely spoke. His phone seemed to be more interesting than the woman who raised him. I asked him once if something was wrong. He looked up, irritated. You always make everything about you. Maybe that's the problem. I didn't know what to say. My throat closed. My hands trembled slightly, but I pressed them against the table to hide it. After that, I stopped asking, but it didn't stop there. He began to rewrite the story of our past. I started hearing strange things from family friends. Comments Daniel made about how I was controlling, manipulative, even emotionally neglectful. He told people I made him feel like he was never good enough, that I constantly criticized him. I was shocked. Had I? Had I been that kind of mother without realizing it? The doubt crept in like black ink in clear water. I questioned my own memories. I stayed up late at night, scrolling through old photos, looking for signs. A furrowed brow, a tight-lipped smile. Anything. I even went to therapy. My therapist told me something that shook me. You can do everything right as a parent and still raise a child who doesn't love you the way you deserve. It felt like grief. There were good moments. That's what made it harder. He'd send me a birthday card that said, "Love you, Mom." He'd call when he needed something, help with taxes, a favor, a recipe. And for a few minutes, it felt like the old days. I clung to those moments like lifelines. But then came the cold silence again, the irritation, the snide comments. Maybe you should stop watching so much TV and actually do something. You wonder why no one calls you. Maybe it's because you guilt trip everyone. God, Mom, you're so dramatic. Each sentence was a cut, a small, slicing wound. And the worst part, I let him. I thought, if I just held on, if I kept giving, if I stayed kind, he'd remember. He'd come back. He didn't. And then came the breaking point. My sister passed away. She and I were very close. Daniel knew that. She had been like a second mother to him. At the funeral, he showed up late, sat in the back, left before I could even hug him. I called him after, just to ask why. I didn't feel like dealing with your emotional outbursts, he said flatly. You make everything worse. That night, I cried in the kitchen, the kind of cry that leaves you breathless, hunched over, as if your heart is physically tearing. That was when I realized it wasn't going to change, not because I hadn't tried hard enough, but because he didn't want to change. Something in me began to shift. I stopped texting him every morning. I stopped inviting him over for dinner. I gave myself space, not him. And in that space, I started to breathe again. At first, the silence felt unbearable, like standing in an empty room where someone used to live. But then, it started to feel like peace. And for the first time in years, I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't see a failure. I saw a woman who had loved fully, maybe too much. But not wrongly. I started questioning everything. The home I had built, the sacrifices I had made, the memories we once shared. Were they all just illusions I created to protect myself? Or had something truly shifted in my child over the years, something I couldn't fix no matter how hard I tried? It's not easy to say your child hurt you. Not physically, no. That would be simpler to prove, easier to name. But emotional abuse, it's a slow bleed, a silent theft of your worth, your peace, your trust. My friends didn't understand. "You're the parent," they'd say. "Just set boundaries." They didn't see the way I was spoken to, like I was a burden, an embarrassment, an obstacle to be tolerated. They didn't hear the condescension in every phone call, the way my voice trembled when I said something wrong, afraid of being snapped at or worse, completely dismissed. The gaslighting was the worst. I'd bring up something that happened, a moment that left me crying in the kitchen, clutching the phone like it was a weapon, and I'd be told, "That's not what I said," or "You're being dramatic." At some point, I started to believe them. Maybe I was dramatic. Maybe I did exaggerate. Maybe I was the problem. But then I began to notice patterns. I kept a journal, not to record memories, but to validate my own sanity. The same phrases, the same belittlements, the same emotional withdrawals and sudden affection, a cycle I couldn't escape. There were moments when I thought I was finally getting through. A warm conversation, a kind gesture, a visit without tension. I'd feel hope bloom in my chest, fragile but real. Then something would go wrong. A comment taken out of context, a perceived slight, and the switch would flip. Silence, blame, cold words that cut deeper than any knife. I remember the holidays most vividly. I would spend days cooking their favorite dishes, decorating the house, trying to recreate some version of a warm, loving home. And every time, they would arrive late, on their phone, offering a quick hug and an even quicker sigh. The meal would end with some passive-aggressive remark about how I still made everything so heavy. I'd excuse myself to the bathroom, tears pooling in my eyes, praying they wouldn't notice, but they always noticed, and they never asked. That's the cruelty of emotional abuse. It hides behind plausible deniability. "I didn't yell at you. You're too sensitive. I was just being honest." Honesty without empathy is brutality. I tried to confront them once. I planned it for weeks, rehearsed every word in my head, practiced staying calm. I even printed out some of the journal pages to show the consistency, the hurt. They laughed and said, "You've really lost it, haven't you?" That was the moment something broke in me, not in a loud, dramatic way, quietly, like a bridge finally giving way after years of unnoticed erosion. I didn't speak to them for 3 months after that. It wasn't revenge, it was survival, and in that silence I started to heal. I reconnected with old friends, I started therapy. I read books on boundaries, on toxic relationships, on the strange grief of being hurt by someone you love more than your own life. I stopped making excuses for them. I stopped twisting myself into knots, trying to be lovable in their eyes. Because the truth is, love isn't something you should have to earn, especially not from your own child. They eventually reached out, an email, polite, detached, no apology, just an invitation to talk if I was ready. I wasn't, not ready to be hurt again, not ready to step back into the role of the emotional punching bag. But I was ready to say something different this time. I said, "I love you, but I won't let you treat me this way anymore. If you want a relationship, it has to be one built on respect. They didn't reply for a long time, and that silence hurt too. But it was different now, because it wasn't breaking me. It was freeing me. I still hope that they will heal, grow, see the harm, take responsibility. But my well-being no longer depends on it. I am more than a mother. I am a human being who deserves kindness. And if you're listening to this, feeling the sting of familiar wounds, please remember, it is not weak to demand respect, even from your own child, especially from them. Subscribe for more stories that speak what others are too afraid to say.